Ma'am, you need to step back and let the real first-class passengers through. The words hit Zara Williams like ice water, but her expression didn't change. She stood at the polished granite counter of JFK Terminal 5's exclusive first-class check-in area, her boarding pass clearly marked 2A in her steady hand, watching Victoria Sterling's eyes scan her with practiced dismissal. Victoria had made her decision in less than 3 seconds, the way people always did when they saw a black woman in spaces they believed belonged to others. Zara was 32 years old and worth more money than most small nations, but Victoria didn't know that. She saw expensive clothes without designer logos, understated jewelry, a woman who carried herself with quiet confidence rather than demanding attention. Zara preferred it that way. She had learned long ago that real power didn't announce itself with golden nameplates or flashy displays of wealth. It moved silently, decisively, like water finding cracks in a foundation. The morning had started before dawn in her Manhattan penthouse, 20 floors above a city that never stopped moving. Zara had stood at floor-to-ceiling windows, watching early commuters stream across distant bridges like blood cells through arteries while reviewing documents for what would be the most important meeting of her career. Phoenix Financial Group, the empire she had built from nothing, was hours away from closing a deal that would reshape European markets and put her company at the center of international banking. Her assistant, Nina, had called at 5:30, her voice crisp and efficient over the encrypted line. The Swiss consortium confirmed the meeting for 2:00 Zurich time, Nina had said. The bridge loan documentation is ready for signature, and the wire transfer protocols are standing by. $2.8 billion would move with her signature funding acquisitions and mergers across 3 countries. It was the kind of deal that made headlines when it succeeded and destroyed careers when it failed. Zara had dressed carefully that morning, choosing a charcoal cashmere blazer that whispered rather than shouted, Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people's cars, but looked quietly elegant rather than ostentatious. She never wore jewelry beyond a simple watch, never carried bags with visible logos, never dressed in a way that demanded recognition. She had learned that lesson the hard way growing up in Brooklyn, where showing wealth made you a target, and later in boardrooms where displaying it made you a performance. The ride to JFK had been silent except for the hum of encrypted phones and the soft leather seats of her private car. Zara preferred to think in motion, watching the city blur past while her mind organized the complexities of international finance into clean, executable strategies. She thought about the Swiss bankers she would meet in 8 hours. Men who had built their fortunes on discretion and tradition, who would respect her results more than her background if she gave them the chance. But first she had to get there. Now she stood in the first-class check-in area, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being judged before she spoke. Victoria Sterling was mid-40s, platinum blonde hair, pulled back in a style that suggested authority, wearing a navy designer dress that hugged her curves perfectly, and the kind of smile that looked warm from a distance, but felt cold up close. Her eyes had already moved past Zara toward the door, scanning for passengers she deemed more worthy of attention. Behind the counter, she commanded the space like a queen holding court, her posture radiating the confidence of someone who had never been told she didn't belong anywhere. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Zara said, her voice steady and calm. She placed her passport next to the boarding pass on the counter, the documents aligned with the precision of someone accustomed to details mattering. "I'm checking in for flight 447 to Zurich, first-class seat 2A. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She glanced down at the documents with the reluctant attention of someone being asked to solve a problem they didn't believe existed. "The premium check-in is by invitation. Only," she said, her tone sweetening in a way that felt like condescension wrapped in courtesy. "Economy and business check-in are down the hall to the left. You'll find the staff there very helpful." Zara felt the moment stretch between them weighted with assumptions and expectations that had shaped too many encounters in her life. She could see other passengers in her peripheral vision settled into leather chairs with champagne and financial newspapers, the kind of space she had earned access to long before she could afford it. But Victoria saw something different when she looked at Zara. Something that made her certain she was dealing with someone who didn't belong. "I understand your confusion," Zara replied, her tone remaining level. "I have a first-class ticket, and I'm requesting first-class check-in service." She didn't raise her voice or lean forward aggressively. She had learned that showing frustration gave people permission to dismiss her as emotional or difficult. Instead, she waited, letting the silence do the work that anger couldn't. Victoria picked up the boarding pass with 2 fingers as if it might be contaminated and scanned the barcode with her handheld device. The machine beeped once, green light flashing confirmation. Zara watched Victoria's expression shift subtly, confusion replacing certainty as if the technology was contradicting what her eyes had already decided. "There seems to be some kind of error in the computer," Victoria murmured more to herself than to Zara. She typed rapidly on her keyboard nails, clicking against keys with increasing intensity. "Mr. David Kim checked in for 2A about 20 minutes ago. He's one of our most valued platinum members." The name landed with recognition that Zara kept hidden behind neutral features. David Kim, venture capitalist, old money family, the kind of man who confused inherited privilege with earned authority. Zara knew him by reputation and financial exposure, though they had never met personally. More importantly, she knew exactly who was funding his upcoming European venture, the tech acquisition he had been discussing in business magazines for the past 6 months. "I purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago," Zara said, leaning slightly forward, but keeping her voice conversational. "I have a critical meeting in Zurich that cannot be rescheduled. Please resolve this immediately." Victoria's jaw tightened with the kind of irritation that came from having her judgment questioned by someone she had already categorized as beneath concern. "Miss Williams," she said, reading the name from the passport as if it might be fake. "I can offer you an upgrade to business class with a $500 travel voucher. But Mr. Kim has priority status and confirmed international connections. I cannot move him." The words hung in the air between them, final and absolute. Zara understood exactly what was being said beneath the professional language. Priority belonged to people who looked like they deserved it, and she would be accommodated only after everyone else's comfort was secured. From across the premium lounge area, Marco Rodriguez had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort. The 28-year-old travel blogger had seen this scenario play out too many times in airports around the world, but something about the woman's calm dignity and the gate agent's obvious bias made him reach for his phone. He opened Instagram Live and pointed the camera toward the check-in counter, speaking quietly into the microphone. "We're at JFK Terminal 5, and I'm watching something that shouldn't be happening in 2024. A black woman with a first-class ticket is being told she can't check in because someone else is in her seat." The viewer count started climbing immediately. Marco had built a following documenting travel discrimination, and his audience knew that when he went live, unexpectedly something important was happening. Meanwhile, Jessica Palmer sat in a nearby leather armchair, supposedly focused on her laptop, but increasingly distracted by the conversation at the check-in counter. As a white business executive who traveled constantly, she had witnessed scenes like this before, usually choosing to look away rather than get involved. But something about Zara's composure and Victoria's obvious hostility made her uncomfortable. She quietly activated her phone's voice recorder, not sure why, but sensing that whatever was happening might need documentation. Victoria had moved away from the computer terminal and was now standing with her arms crossed, having apparently decided that technology wasn't going to support the narrative she preferred. "Miss Williams, I'm going to need you to understand something," Victoria said, her voice taking on the patient condescension of a teacher explaining reality to a slow student. "People like you always try to game the system, Fake upgrades, buddy passes someone else's confirmation numbers. I've been doing this for 15 years and I know how to spot it. The accusation hit the air like a slap. Marco's live stream viewer count jumped past 500 as people began sharing the link. Comments started flooding in, most expressing outrage at what they were witnessing. Zara's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. She had heard variations of this dismissal her entire career. The assumption that her success must be charity rather than capability, that her presence in elite spaces required explanation and justification. Before she could respond, footsteps approached from the side. Brandon Walsh, a 29-year-old customer service representative, appeared with the kind of eager helpfulness that suggested he had been watching the situation and decided to insert himself as backup. "Is there a problem here?" Victoria Brandon asked, though his tone suggested he had already decided who was at fault. His eyes flicked over Zara with the same dismissive assessment she had received from Victoria, then back to his supervisor with a look that said he was ready to support whatever narrative she needed. "No problem," Victoria said, settling deeper into her authority. "Just someone trying to use documentation that doesn't match our records. Miss Williams seems to think she belongs in first class." Brandon nodded with exaggerated understanding. "Computer glitch?" he asked, though both he and Victoria knew the system had confirmed Zara's ticket perfectly. "Must be," Victoria replied. "I'll need to manually verify everything before we can proceed." From her position near the window, Jessica Palmer found herself leaning forward, straining to hear the conversation. As someone who had built her career in corporate environments, she recognized the coded language being used, the way legitimate processes were being weaponized to create obstacles for someone who didn't fit their expectations. She looked around the first-class lounge area, noting how other passengers were beginning to pay attention. Most were white. Most were male. Most looked exactly like the type of people Victoria expected to see in this space. Jessica pulled out her phone and opened LinkedIn. Not sure what she planned to post, but feeling like this moment needed more witnesses than just the travel blogger across the room. At the check-in counter, Victoria had called over Carmen Valdez, a 26-year-old security officer, whose expression suggested she was uncomfortable with whatever request was about to be made. Carmen Victoria said, her voice loud enough to ensure other passengers could hear, "I need you to escort this lady to the appropriate check-in area. She's been attempting to access premium services without proper authorization." Carmen looked between Victoria and Zara, clearly sensing that something wasn't right about the situation. Zara's documents appeared legitimate. Her demeanor was calm and professional, and Carmen had enough training to recognize when someone was being profiled rather than processed. "Ma'am," Carmen said to Zara, her voice apologetic, "can I see your boarding pass and ID again?" Zara handed over the documents, noting how Carmen examined them with actual attention rather than the performative skepticism Victoria had displayed. "These look valid to me," Carmen said quietly to Victoria. The barcode scanned correctly. The name matches the passport, and the seat assignment is clearly marked. Victoria's eyes flashed with irritation. "Carmen? I've been doing this longer than you've been alive. I know suspicious documentation when I see it." The exchange had drawn the attention of David Kim himself, who emerged from the first-class lounge area with a champagne flute in hand and the confident stride of someone accustomed to having problems solved for him. He was exactly what Victoria expected in a first-class passenger, well-dressed, expensively groomed, carrying himself with the unconscious authority of inherited wealth. "Is there some kind of delay?" David asked, his tone suggesting that delays were things that happened to other people, not to him. "Just resolving a seating confusion," Victoria said, her smile returning to full brightness for the first time since Zara had approached the counter. "Mr. Kim, your seat is secure. We're just handling someone who seems to have gotten confused about her ticket type." David looked at Zara for the first time, his eyes taking in her appearance with the same dismissive assessment that had become depressingly familiar. "These mix-ups happen all the time," he said, not unkindly, but with the casual authority of someone explaining the natural order of things. Usually it's people trying to use companion upgrades or employee discounts they're not entitled to. Marco's live stream was now approaching 1,000 viewers, and the comments were becoming increasingly heated. He had turned his phone to capture David's comments, and his audience was responding with a mixture of outrage and recognition. "This is exactly what we're talking about," Marco said quietly into his phone. 3 people now assuming this woman doesn't belong here just because of how she looks. Jessica Palmer had heard enough. She stood up from her chair, closed her laptop, and walked toward the check-in counter with the determined stride of someone who had decided to get involved whether she was welcome or not. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the conversation with corporate authority. "I've been sitting over there for the past 10 minutes and I've watched this entire interaction. That woman has done nothing except try to check in with valid documentation." Victoria turned toward Jessica with surprise, clearly not expecting to deal with multiple challenges to her authority. "Ma'am, this is a customer service matter that doesn't require additional input," Victoria said, though her tone was more respectful than what she had used with Zara. "Actually, it does," Jessica replied firmly. "Because what I'm watching looks a lot like racial profiling, and as someone who travels for business constantly, I find that completely unacceptable." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's face flushed red. Brandon stepped backward slightly, and Carmen nodded almost imperceptibly in agreement. David Kim looked uncomfortable for the first time since arriving, sensing that the situation was escalating beyond a simple seating dispute. Zara remained perfectly still throughout this exchange, watching the dynamics shift around her while maintaining the calm composure that had carried her through countless similar situations. She had been in this moment too many times before, the moment when other people decided whether her dignity was worth defending, when witnesses chose between comfort and conscience, when bystanders became allies or enablers. But this time felt different. This time she had resources that most people facing discrimination could only dream of, and she was about to use them. The tension at the check-in counter had reached a breaking point, with multiple conversations happening simultaneously and Marco's live stream viewer count climbing past 1,500. Victoria Sterling found herself facing challenges from directions she hadn't anticipated, and her carefully maintained professional facade was beginning to crack under pressure. Jessica Palmer's accusation of racial profiling had clearly struck a nerve, and Victoria's response came with more venom than she had probably intended to reveal. "Miss Palmer, I presume," Victoria said, having noticed Jessica's platinum frequent flyer tag, "you've clearly misunderstood the situation. This has nothing to do with anyone's race and everything to do with proper procedures and legitimate documentation." She turned back to Zara with renewed aggression, as if Jessica's intervention had given her permission to drop any pretense of professional courtesy. Miss Williams Victoria continued, her voice rising just enough to ensure everyone in the area could hear, "You need to learn your place. This is first class. These are premium services for premium passengers. Whatever game you think you're playing ends now." The phrase hit the space like a physical blow. Marco's phone captured it perfectly, the audio crystal clear, as Victoria's words rippled across his live stream audience. Comments exploded across the screen, and the viewer count jumped past 2,000 in seconds. Carmen Valdez actually took a step backward, her face showing obvious discomfort with the direction the conversation had taken. Even David Kim looked surprised by the directness of Victoria's language, though he didn't intervene. Brandon Walsh, however, seemed emboldened by his supervisor's escalation. He moved closer to Zara with the kind of performative authority that suggested he was ready to make the situation physical, if necessary. "Ma'am," Brandon said, reaching toward Zara's arm, "I'm going to need you to come with me to resolve this issue in a more appropriate setting." The moment his hand moved toward her, several things happened simultaneously. Jessica Palmer stepped forward with obvious alarm. Carmen Valdez moved into a position that blocked Brandon's approach. Marco's live stream audience erupted in outrage that was visible even to people passing by his phone screen. But Zara Williams didn't move. She looked directly at Victoria Sterling with the kind of calm certainty that came from having made a decision that couldn't be unmade. "You're making the biggest mistake of your professional life," Zara said, her voice carrying just enough to reach everyone within earshot, but maintaining the controlled tone that had characterized her entire interaction. Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Really? And what exactly are you going to do about it? File a complaint, write a bad review, call the manager." She gestured around the first-class area with theatrical confidence. "This is my domain, Miss Williams. I decide who belongs here and who doesn't. And you don't." Zara reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling to a contact she rarely used for personal matters. The call connected on the second ring. "Nina, it's Zara. I need you to initiate Protocol 7 immediately." There was no pause on the other end, no confusion, just immediate understanding. Nina Torres had been Zara's executive assistant for 4 years, and she understood both the complexities of international finance and the importance of calls that began with protocol numbers. "All systems ready," Nina's voice came through clearly enough for people nearby to hear. "What's the target terminal operations, gate management contracts, and customer service oversight for American Airlines at JFK Terminal 5? Zara said, her eyes never leaving Victoria's face. "Full review of all partnership agreements, immediate suspension of current contracts pending investigation." Victoria's expression began to change as she processed words that sounded more complex and threatening than a typical customer complaint. But she still didn't understand what was actually happening. "Partnership agreements," Victoria said with forced laughter. "What are you talking about?" Nina's voice crackled through the phone speaker. "Zara, I'm showing American Airlines owes Phoenix Financial Group approximately $400 million in facility leases, gate management fees, and terminal operations contracts. Should I flag all accounts for immediate review?" The number hit the space like a detonation. David Kim's champagne flute stopped halfway to his lips. Brandon Walsh's hand fell to his side. Carmen Valdez looked between Zara and Victoria with dawning understanding. But Victoria still didn't grasp the magnitude of what was happening. Years of unchallenged authority had left her unable to imagine consequences that couldn't be managed through the normal channels of corporate hierarchy and customer service protocols. "This is ridiculous," Victoria said, though her voice had lost some of its confidence. "I don't know what kind of performance this is, but threatening to involve corporate isn't going to change anything. You still don't belong in first class." Marco's live stream had exploded past 3,000 viewers, and he was struggling to keep up with comments that were coming too fast to read. His audience was frantically sharing the link across social media platforms, and hashtags were already forming around Victoria's "Learn Your Place" comment. Jessica Palmer had moved close enough to hear Nina's side of the conversation, and her corporate experience was helping her understand implications that others were still missing. She pulled out her own phone and began typing rapidly on LinkedIn, crafting a post that would reach her network of business executives and corporate leaders before the story could be controlled or minimized. But the person who understood the situation most clearly was Carmen Valdez, whose security training had taught her to recognize when authority structures were about to shift dramatically. She moved into a position that protected Zara, rather than threatening her, sensing that the dynamics in the room were about to reverse completely. Nina's voice came through the phone again, crisp and professional. "Zara, I'm also showing that Phoenix International Risk Management provides loan guarantees for several of David Kim's venture capital deals. Should those be included in the review?" This time, David Kim himself went pale. The venture capitalist who had been casually dismissing Zara's presence suddenly realized that she might have the power to destroy his European acquisition deal with a single phone call. Zara looked directly at Victoria Sterling, whose beautiful, perfectly composed face was finally showing cracks of uncertainty. Miss Sterling, Zara said quietly, "You've shown me exactly who you are. And now I'm going to show you exactly who I am." The first-class check-in area had gone completely silent except for the murmur of Marco's live-stream commentary and the increasingly frantic beeping of phones as news of the confrontation began spreading across social media platforms. Victoria Sterling, who had started the morning confident in her authority and certain of her judgments, was about to discover that assumptions could be very expensive mistakes. And Zara Williams, who had simply wanted to check in for a flight to Zurich, was about to demonstrate what happened when power met principle in a space where privilege had operated without accountability for far too long. The first-class check-in area had fallen into an eerie silence broken only by the soft ping of notifications as Marco's live stream reached viral status. Victoria Sterling stood frozen behind her counter, her mind struggling to process the financial terms that had been casually discussed over Zara's phone call, while other passengers began to gather at a respectful distance, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Captain James Mitchell emerged from the gate area with purposeful strides, carrying a tablet and wearing the expression of someone who had been urgently briefed on a situation that required his immediate attention. At 45, he had the weathered confidence of someone who had handled countless crises, but his face showed a level of concern that suggested this was different from typical passenger disputes. He approached the check-in counter with the measured pace of someone who understood that whatever happened in the next few minutes would likely determine the trajectory of several careers and possibly the reputation of the entire terminal operation. "Miss Williams," Captain Mitchell said, stopping directly in front of Zara with a respectful nod that immediately distinguished his demeanor from everyone else who had interacted with her. "I need to apologize personally. I've just reviewed our partnership agreements, and I want to make sure we resolve this situation appropriately." Victoria's confusion was visible as she watched the captain treat Zara with a level of deference that contradicted everything she thought she knew about the passenger hierarchy. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Marco's live stream audience had exploded past 5,000 viewers, and comments were flooding in faster than he could track. The algorithm was pushing his stream to travel and social justice communities around the world, and the story was beginning to take on a life of its own. Partnership agreements. Victoria finally managed to say, her voice smaller than it had been all morning. "Captain, I think there might be some confusion. Miss Williams is just a passenger trying to access services she's not entitled to." Captain Mitchell looked at Victoria with the kind of patient expression reserved for someone who was about to receive information that would fundamentally change their understanding of reality. "Miss Sterling," he said, consulting his tablet, "I'm going to need you to stop talking and listen very carefully. Miss Williams is not just a passenger. She's the CEO of Phoenix Financial Group, which owns 60% of the facility management contracts for this terminal, including gate operations, customer service oversight, and premium passenger services." The words landed like a physical impact. Victoria's face went from confused to pale to ashen in the space of seconds. Brandon Walsh audibly gasped and took several steps backward. David Kim set his champagne flute down with shaking hands. But Victoria still couldn't fully process what she was being told. Years of unchallenged authority had created a mental framework where she was the ultimate arbiter of who belonged in first class, and that framework was proving difficult to dismantle even in the face of devastating information. "That's impossible," Victoria said, though her voice carried no conviction. She gestured weakly toward Zara's simple attire and understated appearance. "She doesn't look like... if she was really..." She trailed off as she realized that completing that sentence would only make her situation worse. Jessica Palmer, who had been watching the revelation unfold with growing satisfaction, stepped forward with her phone extended recording video that would shortly appear on LinkedIn with a caption about witnessing karmic justice in real time. She doesn't look like what exactly Jessica asked, her corporate executive training kicking in as she recognized an opportunity to create accountability for discriminatory assumptions. "Finish that thought, Miss Sterling. What does a CEO look like?" Marco had begun providing live commentary for his audience, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who realized they were documenting a historic moment in travel industry. Accountability. "You guys, this is incredible," he said into his phone. "This gate agent has been discriminating against a woman who literally owns the terminal they're standing in. The CEO just revealed herself, and the gate agent still can't believe it." Carmen Valdez had moved into a protective position near Zara, her security training helping her understand that the power dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and that her job now was to ensure that the real authority figure was treated with appropriate respect. Captain Mitchell continued reading from his tablet, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering information that would reshape careers and corporate relationships. Phoenix Financial Group's contracts with American Airlines include terminal operations, gate management, customer service standards, and discrimination prevention protocols, he read. As per Section 12 of the Facility Management Agreement, Phoenix Financial Group has the authority to review, modify, or terminate service relationships based on customer service performance and adherence to equality standards. Nina Torres's voice crackled through Zara's phone, still connected and clearly audible to everyone in the immediate area. "Captain Mitchell, this is Nina Torres, Executive Assistant to Ms. Williams. We're prepared to initiate a full review of customer service protocols based on the documented discrimination that occurred this morning. Should I begin the formal process?" Victoria Sterling's carefully constructed professional composure finally cracked completely. The elegant, poised woman who had been confidently determining who belonged in first class was now visibly shaking as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. "Miss Williams, Victoria," said her voice breaking slightly. I didn't know. If you had told me who you were, I would never—" Zara looked at Victoria with the calm intensity that had carried her through decades of similar encounters, though none had ever provided her with this level of leverage to create consequences. "Miss Sterling Zara," said her voice carrying clearly to Marco's live stream and Jessica's LinkedIn video. "The problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you didn't think it mattered who I was. You made assumptions about my worth based on my appearance, and you were willing to treat me with disrespect because you believed you had the power to do so without consequences." The truth of that statement hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or explain away. Victoria had revealed her true character not through malice toward a specific person, but through casual cruelty toward someone she perceived as powerless. Captain Mitchell closed his tablet and looked directly at Victoria with the expression of someone who had seen enough to make decisions that couldn't be unmade. "Miss Sterling, you're suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Please collect your personal belongings and report to Human Resources within the hour." The termination was swift, professional, and final. Victoria's mouth opened in protest, but Captain Mitchell continued before she could speak. "Mr. Walsh, you're also suspended for enabling discriminatory behavior and failing to follow proper customer service protocols." Brandon Walsh, who had been hoping to remain invisible since the captain's arrival, found himself suddenly unemployed with no warning and no opportunity to distance himself from Victoria's choices. Nina Torres's voice came through Zara's phone again, crisp and efficient, delivering updates that painted a picture of consequences spreading far beyond the first-class check-in counter. "Ms. Williams, I'm showing immediate market reactions. American Airlines stock has dropped 8% in the past 15 minutes as news of the discrimination incident reaches trading floors. Terminal management is requesting an emergency meeting, and legal is asking for instructions on how to handle media inquiries." The speed of the financial impact was staggering. Marco's live stream had been shared across multiple platforms. Jessica's LinkedIn post was generating hundreds of comments from business executives, and the combination of social media virality and financial market sensitivity was creating consequences that moved faster than anyone could have anticipated. Zara looked around the first-class area, noting how other passengers were frantically checking their phones for market updates, news alerts, and social media posts about what they were witnessing in real time. David Kim had gone from casually dismissive to genuinely panicked as he realized that his European venture deal was likely dependent on financing arrangements that could be affected by the very woman he had suggested didn't belong in first class. He approached Zara with the careful movements of someone who suddenly understood that I want to apologize for my comments. I want to apologize for my comments. I spoke without thinking, and I was completely wrong. Zara studied his face, recognizing the difference between apology motivated by conscience and apology motivated by fear of consequences. David Kim was clearly in the latter category, but his panic was providing its own form of education about the cost of casual discrimination. Mr. Kim Zara replied calmly, "Your financing for the European tech acquisition flows through Phoenix International Risk Management. My team is currently reviewing all partnerships for compliance with our non-discrimination policies." The statement hit David like a physical blow. His venture capital firm's biggest deal was suddenly in jeopardy because he had chosen to support discrimination rather than challenge it. The casual comment about people using upgrades they weren't entitled to was about to cost him everything he had been working toward for the past 2 years. Nina's voice continued providing updates that documented the speed with which modern communication networks could transform a local incident into a global business story. Reuters has picked up the story Nina reported. The headline is "Airline Discrimination Incident Triggers Stock Drop and Executive Suspensions." CNN Business is requesting an interview, and the FAA is asking for documentation of our anti-discrimination protocols. Marco's live stream had become the primary source for real-time information about the incident, and his audience had grown to include journalists, civil rights activists, and business leaders who were watching corporate accountability unfold in real time. His commentary was providing context that helped viewers understand the broader implications of what they were witnessing. "This isn't just about one gate agent or one airline," Marco said to his audience, which had now exceeded 10,000 viewers. "This is about how quickly discrimination can become expensive when the person being discriminated against has the resources to create immediate consequences." Carmen Valdez had remained in her protective position near Zara, but her role had evolved from security officer to witness protection as media attention intensified and more people began recognizing the significance of what had occurred. Captain Mitchell was fielding calls from multiple American Airlines executives, his conversation providing a soundtrack of corporate crisis management as upper management tried to understand how a routine passenger dispute had evolved into a stock-moving news story. Terminal manager Robert Hayes arrived with a small team of corporate representatives, his face showing the strain of someone who had been pulled away from a normal Tuesday morning to handle a crisis that could affect his entire career trajectory. "Miss Williams," Robert said, approaching with the deferential respect that should have been provided from the beginning, "I want to personally apologize on behalf of American Airlines and assure you that this incident does not represent our values or our training standards." Zara looked at the assembled group of corporate executives, noting how quickly the narrative had shifted from questioning her right to be in first class to ensuring that she felt appropriately respected and valued. "Mr. Hayes," Zara replied, "the incident represents exactly what your training standards produce when they're not properly enforced. Miss Sterling didn't act alone or in isolation. She acted based on assumptions that your company culture permits and protects." The accusation was devastating because it was accurate. Victoria Sterling's behavior hadn't been an aberration, but a predictable result of an environment where discrimination was tolerated as long as it remained polite and deniable. Nina's voice provided another update that demonstrated how quickly financial markets responded to stories involving discrimination and corporate accountability. Stock is now down 12%, and institutional investors are requesting immediate clarification on our partnership agreements. Phoenix Group's legal team is drafting a statement about our zero-tolerance policies for discrimination. Jessica Palmer had been documenting the entire sequence of events for her LinkedIn network, and her post was generating responses from corporate diversity officers around the world, who recognized the incident as a case study in how discrimination creates business risk. She approached Zara with the respectful demeanor of someone who had learned an important lesson about the cost of remaining silent when witnessing injustice. Miss Williams Jessica said, "I want to thank you for handling this situation with such grace and strength. I've seen incidents like this before, and I've usually chosen not to get involved. Today showed me that silence is complicity." Zara nodded appreciatively, recognizing that Jessica's evolution from bystander to ally was one of the most important outcomes of the entire confrontation. The circle of corporate executives around them continued to grow as more American Airlines management arrived to assess the damage and determine how to prevent further escalation of a crisis that was affecting their company's reputation and stock price in real time. But the most significant development was happening on social media and financial markets, where the story was evolving from a travel discrimination incident into a broader conversation about corporate accountability, the power of financial leverage to enforce civil rights, and the speed with which modern communication networks could transform individual acts of courage into movements for change. The first-class check-in area had transformed into an impromptu crisis management center, with corporate executives, media representatives, and passengers creating a complex web of conversations that all centered on the quiet woman in the simple blazer who had revealed herself as one of the most powerful people in the terminal. Nina Torres's voice continued providing updates that painted a picture of consequences spreading throughout the airline industry as other carriers scrambled to review their own discrimination policies and customer service protocols. Ms. Williams Nina reported, "I'm receiving calls from Delta United and JetBlue requesting meetings to discuss their Phoenix Financial Group relationships. Everyone wants to ensure they're in compliance with our anti-discrimination standards." The speed with which other airlines were responding demonstrated how quickly a single incident could reshape industry practices when the stakes included hundreds of millions of dollars in financing and facility management contracts. Marco's live stream had become the primary news source for the incident, and his audience now included reporters from major news outlets who were using his footage to understand what had actually occurred before the corporate spin could complicate the narrative. His commentary was helping viewers grasp the broader significance of what they were witnessing. "What we're seeing here is accountability happening in real time," Marco said to his audience, which had grown beyond 15,000 viewers. When discrimination has immediate financial consequences, companies respond immediately. This is what justice looks like when it has leverage. Terminal manager Robert Hayes was coordinating with multiple American Airlines executives, their conversations revealing the scope of the crisis they were trying to manage. The discrimination incident had triggered a comprehensive review of customer service policies, staff training protocols, and partnership agreements that could take months to resolve. But the most immediate concern was preventing further damage to relationships with Phoenix Financial Group, whose contracts represented too large a portion of JFK Terminal 5's revenue to risk through inadequate response to the discrimination incident. Miss Williams Robert said, returning to Zara with an updated action plan, "We've implemented immediate changes to our customer service protocols. All gate agents and customer service representatives will undergo emergency anti-discrimination training this week, and we're establishing direct reporting lines for bias incidents." The changes represented the kind of rapid corporate response that usually required months of committee meetings and policy development. But financial pressure was creating an environment where transformation could happen in hours rather than seasons. Carmen Valdez had been quietly documenting the entire sequence of events in her security report, creating an official record that would likely be used in training programs and legal proceedings for years to come. Her position had evolved from potential enforcement of Victoria's discrimination to protection of the victim, demonstrating how quickly authority structures could shift when power dynamics were revealed and reversed. Jessica Palmer was receiving responses to her LinkedIn posts that demonstrated how the story was resonating throughout corporate America. Business executives were sharing their own experiences with workplace discrimination, and discussing how financial accountability might create incentives for better behavior that traditional legal remedies couldn't achieve. She approached Zara again this time with specific questions about how other companies could implement similar accountability measures. Miss Williams, Jessica said my company works with dozens of vendors and service providers. How can we structure our contracts to include anti-discrimination provisions that have real consequences? The question revealed how quickly the incident was evolving from a single story into a broader movement for corporate accountability that could reshape business relationships across multiple industries. Zara looked around the terminal area, noting how the conversation had shifted from questioning her right to be in first class to seeking her advice on how to prevent discrimination in other contexts. The transformation was satisfying, but she was also aware that real change would require sustained attention rather than just crisis response. Nina's voice provided another update that demonstrated the global reach of the story and its potential to influence practices beyond the airline industry. International media is covering this as a case study in financial accountability for discrimination. The BBC is calling it the Terminal Incident, and business schools are already requesting permission to develop case studies for their MBA programs. The speed with which the story was being analyzed and incorporated into educational curricula suggested that its impact would extend far beyond the immediate consequences for American Airlines and the specific individuals involved. David Kim had been making increasingly frantic phone calls to his European partners, trying to explain how his venture capital firm's financing had become uncertain because of comments he made during a discrimination incident. His situation was providing a real-time demonstration of how quickly casual bias could become financially catastrophic. He approached Zara one final time, his desperation evident, as he realized that his entire business future might depend on her willingness to separate his firm's financing from his personal behavior. Miss Williams, David said, his voice breaking slightly. I understand that my comments were inappropriate and harmful. Is there any way to resolve this that doesn't destroy my company and the jobs of everyone who works for me? The plea revealed the human cost of discrimination that extended beyond the direct participants to include employees, partners, and families whose futures were connected to decisions made in moments of bias and poor judgment. Zara studied David's face, recognizing genuine remorse mixed with terror about consequences that he was only beginning to understand. Mr. Kim, Zara replied, Your financing review will be based on your firm's compliance with anti-discrimination policies and your willingness to implement meaningful changes in how you evaluate people and opportunities. This morning, you revealed character flaws that create business risks. Addressing those risks is your responsibility. The response offered a path forward that required genuine change rather than just apology, creating accountability that could lead to transformation rather than just punishment. Captain Mitchell was coordinating with FAA representatives who had arrived to investigate the incident and determine whether it revealed broader problems with airline customer service training and discrimination prevention. Their presence elevated the situation from a corporate crisis to a potential federal oversight issue, adding another layer of accountability that could influence industry practices nationwide. The first-class check-in area had become a laboratory for testing how quickly justice could operate when it had adequate resources and sufficient leverage to create immediate consequences for discrimination. And at the center of it all, Zara Williams stood with the quiet dignity that had characterized her throughout the entire confrontation, having demonstrated that power used wisely could create accountability that protected not just herself but everyone who would face similar discrimination in the future. The transformation of JFK Terminal 5 began within hours of Zara Williams's revelation as American Airlines executives worked frantically to demonstrate their commitment to preventing discrimination and rebuilding their relationship with Phoenix Financial Group. Emergency meetings were called, policies were rewritten, and training programs were launched with the kind of urgency usually reserved for safety crises. Nina Torres had established a command center in Phoenix Financial Group's Manhattan headquarters, coordinating responses to media inquiries, investor questions, and partnership requests from companies around the world who wanted to demonstrate their own commitment to anti-discrimination policies. The story had evolved from a viral social media moment into a business case study that was being analyzed by corporate boards, diversity officers, and risk management teams across multiple industries. Marco Rodriguez found himself at the center of a media storm, with his live stream footage being licensed by news outlets around the world and his travel blog gaining hundreds of thousands of new followers overnight. His documentation of the incident had become the definitive record of how discrimination looked when it was challenged by someone with the resources to create immediate consequences. He was invited to speak at conferences, contribute to documentaries, and serve as a consultant for companies seeking to understand how social media could amplify accountability for discriminatory behavior. The transformation was deeply personal for Marco, who had spent years documenting travel discrimination without seeing meaningful institutional responses. Watching Zara's calm deployment of financial leverage to create immediate consequences had shown him what was possible when civil rights activism intersected with economic power. Jessica Palmer's LinkedIn post about the incident had generated over 10,000 comments and had been shared by business executives throughout her network. The response demonstrated how many people had witnessed similar incidents but had chosen silence over confrontation, and how Zara's example was inspiring others to reconsider their own responsibilities when they encountered discrimination. Her company had invited her to lead a task force on vendor accountability and discrimination prevention, recognizing that the incident at JFK had revealed vulnerabilities in their own business relationships that needed to be addressed proactively. The personal transformation was significant for Jessica, who had built her career by avoiding controversial situations and maintaining professional neutrality. Witnessing Zara's dignified response to discrimination and seeing the positive outcomes of intervention had convinced her that neutrality in the face of injustice was actually complicity. Carmen Valdez had been promoted to senior security officer and tasked with developing new protocols for handling discrimination complaints and bias incidents. Her report on the Victoria Sterling incident had been praised by federal investigators as a model for how security personnel could protect victims while documenting evidence needed for accountability. The promotion represented more than career advancement. It was recognition that standing up for principle, even when it conflicted with immediate authority, was valued and rewarded by organizations committed to genuine change. Carmen's new role included training other security officers on recognizing and responding to discrimination, ensuring that future incidents would be handled with the professionalism and integrity that she had demonstrated during Zara's confrontation with Victoria. Victoria Sterling had been terminated immediately and found herself unemployable within the airline industry. Her behavior had been documented on social media and in news reports in ways that made her toxic to any company concerned about discrimination liability. She was facing personal bankruptcy, a discrimination lawsuit filed by Zara's legal team, and the complete destruction of a career that had been built on assuming she could treat certain people poorly without consequences. The speed and completeness of Victoria's downfall served as a powerful deterrent to other customer service representatives who might be tempted to let their biases influence their professional behavior. Brandon Walsh had also been terminated and was struggling to find new employment as his involvement in the discrimination incident followed him through background checks and online searches. His decision to enable Victoria's bias rather than challenge it had cost him his career and served as a lesson about the professional risks of complicity. David Kim's venture capital firm had avoided complete destruction, but only after implementing comprehensive anti-discrimination training, establishing diversity oversight committees, and agreeing to regular audits by Phoenix Financial Group's compliance team. His European tech acquisition deal had been delayed by 6 months while his firm demonstrated genuine commitment to change rather than just crisis management, costing millions in opportunity costs and forcing him to confront the real business impact of his casual bias. American Airlines had implemented system-wide changes that went far beyond Terminal 5, recognizing that the incident had revealed vulnerabilities that existed throughout their customer service operations. New training programs, reporting mechanisms, and accountability measures were being rolled out across all their facilities. The changes represented the kind of comprehensive institutional transformation that civil rights advocates had been seeking for decades, achieved not through years of litigation, but through a single morning when discrimination encountered someone with sufficient resources to create immediate consequences. 6 months after the incident at JFK Terminal 5, Zara Williams sat in a congressional hearing room surrounded by cameras and senators who wanted to understand how a single discrimination incident had triggered industry-wide changes in customer service practices and corporate accountability measures. The hearing room was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, business executives, and policy experts who recognized that the terminal incident had created a new model for enforcing anti-discrimination policies through financial leverage rather than traditional legal remedies. Senator Elizabeth Warren opened the hearing with questions that revealed how deeply the incident had influenced discussions about corporate accountability and discrimination prevention. Ms. Williams, Senator Warren began your experience at JFK Terminal 5 has been studied by business schools, cited in discrimination lawsuits, and referenced in corporate board meetings around the world. Can you explain how financial accountability differs from traditional civil rights enforcement? Zara looked around the hearing room, noting the diversity of faces that reflected growing awareness that discrimination was not just a moral issue, but an economic liability that affected market stability and corporate profitability. Senator Warren, traditional civil rights remedies often provide justice after damage has been done, requiring victims to endure years of litigation while discrimination continues. Financial accountability creates immediate consequences that prevent ongoing harm and incentivize institutional change. The distinction was crucial because it explained why the terminal incident had generated such rapid and comprehensive responses from companies that had previously treated discrimination complaints as manageable legal risks rather than existential business threats. Senator Tim Scott followed up with questions that explored the broader implications of using financial leverage to enforce behavioral standards in business relationships. Ms. Williams, some critics have suggested that your response was disproportionate, that destroying careers over a customer service dispute sends the wrong message about forgiveness and redemption. How do you respond to that criticism? Zara had anticipated this question and had prepared an answer that addressed both the personal and institutional dimensions of accountability for discrimination. Senator Scott, discrimination is not a customer service dispute. It's a choice to deny someone equal treatment based on assumptions about their worth and belonging. When people make that choice, they reveal judgment flaws that create risks in any business relationship. Accountability protects future victims more effectively than forgiveness protects past perpetrators. The answer resonated throughout the hearing room and would be quoted in news articles and policy discussions for months afterward, providing a framework for understanding when harsh consequences were justified and necessary. Marco Rodriguez had been invited to testify about the role of social media in documenting discrimination and creating accountability through viral exposure. His live stream of the incident had become a case study in how individual activists could amplify civil rights violations and force institutional responses. His testimony included recommendations for how social media platforms could better support documentation of discrimination and how companies could monitor their own customer service practices through analysis of social media complaints and viral incidents. The Phoenix Initiative. Zara's $50 million fund to support minority-owned travel businesses had already invested in over 30 companies and was generating returns that exceeded industry averages, while creating opportunities for entrepreneurs who had been excluded from traditional financing. The success of the initiative was demonstrating that diversity was not just morally important, but economically advantageous, encouraging other investment funds to prioritize inclusive practices for competitive rather than just ethical reasons. Jessica Palmer had been invited to discuss how individual witnesses could effectively intervene in discrimination incidents and how companies could train employees to recognize and respond to bias in customer service situations. Her transformation from silent bystander to active ally had inspired corporate training programs that emphasized the professional obligations of employees who witnessed discrimination even when they were not directly involved in customer service roles. The hearing included testimony from representatives of major airlines, hotels, and transportation companies who described the industry-wide changes that had been implemented in response to the terminal incident. All major airlines had adopted Phoenix standards for customer service that included specific protocols for handling bias complaints, regular training on discrimination prevention, and financial penalties for violations that were severe enough to influence corporate behavior. The standards represented the kind of industry-wide reform that usually required federal regulation achieved instead through market pressure and the demonstrated willingness of powerful customers to enforce accountability through economic leverage. Federal investigators testified about their findings regarding discrimination in the transportation industry, revealing patterns of bias that had been documented but not addressed through traditional enforcement mechanisms. Their recommendations included new reporting requirements, enhanced oversight of customer service practices, and federal guidelines that would make financial accountability measures like those used by Phoenix Financial Group more systematic and widespread. The hearing concluded with bipartisan recognition that the terminal incident had demonstrated the effectiveness of market-based solutions to discrimination problems that had proven resistant to traditional legal and regulatory approaches. 1 year after the incident that had transformed her from a private business executive into a public symbol of accountability and justice. Zara Williams stood in the renamed Phoenix Terminal at JFK Airport, watching diverse staff members provide respectful service to passengers who reflected the full spectrum of American society. The terminal bore her name not through ego or marketing, but through recognition that her courage in confronting discrimination had created changes that protected thousands of future travelers from experiencing the bias and humiliation that had once been routine in premium travel services. The atmosphere was different now. Customer service representatives had been trained not just in professional courtesy, but in recognizing and preventing discrimination. Oversight mechanisms ensured that bias complaints were investigated immediately rather than buried in bureaucratic processes. Most importantly, staff members understood that treating customers poorly based on assumptions about their appearance or background was not just morally wrong, but professionally suicidal in an industry where accountability had been strengthened through economic leverage. Marco Rodriguez approached Zara near the gate where the incident had occurred, his travel blog having evolved into a consulting company that helped corporations audit their customer service practices for discriminatory patterns and develop accountability measures that prevented rather than just punished bias. Miss Williams Marco said his respect evident in both his tone and posture. I wanted to thank you again for showing all of us what courage looks like when it has resources to create change. Your example has inspired dozens of other activists to use their platforms and leverage to challenge discrimination wherever they encounter it. The ripple effects had extended far beyond the airline industry, with discrimination incidents in hotels, restaurants, retail stores, and corporate offices being met with increasingly sophisticated accountability measures as victims learned to document bias, leverage social media, and apply economic pressure to force institutional responses. Jessica Palmer had joined the board of the Phoenix Initiative and was using her corporate connections to identify and support minority entrepreneurs who were creating innovative solutions to discrimination in business practices. Her transformation from silent witness to active ally had become a model for corporate diversity training programs that emphasized the professional and moral obligations of employees who witnessed bias but were not directly responsible for customer service. Carmen Valdez had been promoted to Director of Customer Experience and was leading training programs that taught security and customer service personnel to recognize discrimination, protect victims, and document incidents in ways that supported accountability rather than enabling cover-ups. Her career advancement demonstrated that standing up for principle was not just morally rewarding, but professionally advantageous in organizations that were genuinely committed to creating inclusive environments. The personal cost for Victoria Sterling had been complete and permanent. Her termination from American Airlines had been followed by unsuccessful lawsuits, personal bankruptcy, and social isolation, as her behavior became a cautionary tale about the professional and personal consequences of letting bias influence business decisions. She was working in a retail job that paid less than half of her former salary, living in a small apartment, and facing ongoing legal costs from Zara's discrimination lawsuit that would likely follow her for the rest of her life. The completeness of Victoria's downfall served as a powerful deterrent that had influenced customer service practices throughout the travel industry as other employees realized that discrimination could destroy careers rather than just create temporary conflicts. David Kim had managed to save his venture capital firm through comprehensive reforms and genuine commitment to diversity, but the experience had cost him millions in delayed deals and lost opportunities, while teaching him that casual bias was an unaffordable luxury in modern business relationships. His firm had become a model for how financial services companies could implement anti-discrimination measures that actually prevented bias, rather than just creating legal protection against discrimination claims. As Zara walked through the terminal that bore her name, she reflected on the journey from that morning when Victoria Sterling had told her to learn her place to this moment when her place was recognized as wherever she chose to be with dignity and respect automatically provided rather than grudgingly granted. The most satisfying aspect of the transformation was not the recognition or the financial impact, but the knowledge that future travelers would be less likely to face the humiliation and bias that had once been routine in premium service environments. Young professionals of color walked confidently through first-class areas knowing that discrimination complaints would be taken seriously and that companies had strong financial incentives to prevent bias rather than just manage its consequences. The incident had demonstrated that justice was most effective when it operated with sufficient speed and severity to create deterrence, rather than just punishment, protecting future victims more effectively than traditional remedies that addressed harm after it had already been inflicted. As Zara boarded her flight to Zurich exactly 1 year after the original incident, she was greeted by staff members who provided exemplary service, not because they had been told who she was, but because professional respect was now the standard expectation for all passengers, regardless of appearance or assumptions about their background. The transformation was systemic rather than personal, creating protection for everyone rather than just recognition for her individual status and influence. The seat in first class had never been about comfort or luxury. It had been about the principle that dignity should not be conditional on other people's approval or recognition, and that respect should be automatically provided, rather than grudgingly granted after identity was proven. That principle had been established not through legal victory or moral argument, but through demonstration that discrimination created business risks that were unacceptable to companies whose financial relationships depended on maintaining inclusive and respectful practices. Looking out the window as the plane climbed above New York City, Zara thought about the meeting waiting for her in Zurich, the financial deals that would reshape international markets, and the empire she continued to build through strategic intelligence and careful planning. But she also thought about Marco's continued activism, Jessica's advocacy work, Carmen's leadership in customer service reform, and the thousands of travelers who would board flights without fear of discrimination, because one morning she had chosen to fight back against assumptions that had operated without consequences for far too long. The cost of that fight had been significant time, energy, public attention, and the burden of becoming a symbol rather than just a successful business executive. But the outcomes had exceeded anything she could have imagined when Victoria Sterling first told her she didn't belong in first class. Justice Zara had learned was most effective when it operated with the speed and precision of financial markets rather than the deliberate pace of traditional legal systems. When discrimination created immediate economic consequences, behavioral change followed with remarkable speed and comprehensive reach. The lesson extended far beyond airline customer service to every industry where bias could be measured, documented, and made financially costly to organizations that preferred inclusion rhetoric to accountability reality. As the flight reached cruising altitude and she opened her laptop to review acquisition agreements for companies that would shape the future of international finance, Zara smiled at the thought that the most important deal of her career had not been negotiated in a boardroom, but established at an airport check-in counter, where she had refused to accept treatment that fell short of the dignity every person deserved. The woman who had been told to learn her place had instead taught the world that her place was wherever she chose to be, with respect automatically provided, and discrimination immediately punished, through consequences that were swift, severe, and educational for everyone watching. That was the legacy she was proudest to leave, not just personal vindication, but systematic change that protected people she would never meet from experiences she never wanted anyone else to endure. This story teaches us that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, but it also shows us something more powerful when we have the resources to create accountability. We have a responsibility to use them, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who will face similar discrimination after us. Zara Williams could have accepted the business class upgrade, avoided confrontation, and moved on with her day. Instead, she chose to fight back, knowing that her response would determine whether discrimination continued to operate without consequences, or whether it would finally face accountability that matched its harm. The most important lesson isn't that financial power can create justice. It's that justice requires courage to act when action is possible, regardless of the personal cost or public attention that might follow. If you've witnessed discrimination, if you've been silent when you could have spoken up, if you've wondered whether one person can really make a difference, remember that change happens when ordinary people make extraordinary choices in ordinary moments. Your voice, your resources, your willingness to act all matter more than you realize. Use them wisely, but use them.